Okay, now it started. All right, so welcome everyone to the Psychology of Resistance in Violent and Repressive Contexts virtual meeting series. That's our very long name of this meeting. Those of you who are new here, we are a group of social psychologists who are interested in bringing together researchers, but also activists who are interested in the topic of resistance in violent and repressive contexts. It is a monthly meeting series, and we have a website that allows you to register for a mailing list and receive updates on our next sessions and also view past recordings, but also submit proposals if you yourself are interested in presenting in this series in the future. So I'll be sending around the link to the series, or actually Fuad or Janan, if you can quickly find it. I pressed away my chat box, so I cannot find the link I had anymore. But we'll be sending it around in case you want to sign up for the mailing list or notifications. Today is the last session in our 2025-2026 series, and we are fortunate today to have a philosopher with us, Dr. Robin Celikates, who is based at the Freie Universität in Berlin in Germany. I will spotlight him now for everyone so you can see. Dr. Celikates is a social philosopher who works on civil disobedience, but also on other topics related to racism and social topics in Germany and in Europe. Today, he will be focusing on the topic of civil disobedience in the context of the climate movement. I won't say much more because I think a lot more will become apparent in the introduction, but the way the format of this will be is Dr. Celikates will talk to us for about 25 or so minutes about the proposals regarding civil disobedience that he also wrote briefly about in the abstract, elaborate a bit more on the concept of civil disobedience in the context of the climate crisis. And then afterwards, we will have a few questions from our team that we put together and be a little bit in dialogue, and afterwards open up to the rest of the group for additional discussion. So the session is scheduled for about 90 minutes. You can use the chat, of course, as well, but it's always a bit difficult to keep track of that. We have, in addition, a Google Doc where we will be doing some collective note-taking if anyone is interested in that. So I think Janan will send around the link to our Google Doc, and if you want, you can also type in your questions there, although again, it's more difficult to keep track of it there. So if possible, we'll ask later for questions in the chat or when we open up. All right, that is all the housekeeping. And so with this, thank you again so much, Robin, for joining us here. And we are very excited to hear what you have to tell us about civil disobedience in the climate context.
Great. Thank you so much, Johanna, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to join this network and present some of my work. Thanks everyone for attending, and I really look forward to the discussion, especially the interdisciplinary discussion and your insights from social psychology. As Johanna mentioned, I'm a philosopher, so I'm mostly looking at the conceptual and normative issues, but I also have a strong kind of sociological interest and a political interest in social movements and disobedience across various fields in relation to migration, racism, the climate crisis. So I'm also very interested in the way in which empirical and theoretical research interact in this field. Okay, so you don't need a reminder, I guess, how serious the situation is concerning the climate crisis humanity is facing. The reports of the IPCC have been increasingly dramatic. The UN General Secretary Guterres has spoken already some years ago of a code red for humanity. Many years ago, again, Greta Thunberg, in her op-ed in the New York Times, has written about the extent of the crisis and the crisis that is also produced by the fact that we don't acknowledge that there is this crisis. And here we are many years later in a situation which is not just sort of getting worse, but getting worse in a way that is somehow accelerating due to the political dynamics and the rise of the far right and authoritarian movements and governments that are, on the one hand, sort of crisis denying and denying climate change, digging in, embracing the fossil fuel economy, such as the Trump government, but also in some ways sort of reacting to the crisis by just saying, well, in this situation, we can only sort of preserve the rights or interests of a particular subset of humanity, but we have to move away from the idea that somehow there can be a universalist sort of response to this. In the meantime, the extreme weather events that people even in the global north are confronting are getting more and more extreme, and with the super El Nino around the corner, this will again shape the next years for many of us, I think. At the same time, there has been not only a growing climate movement, again, Greta Thunberg and the school strike, and then Fridays for Future have been sort of leading one leading strand that kind of kicked off the more recent wave of protest that has then also involved other groups such as Extinction Rebellion in the UK and the Gelände group in Germany and many others across the globe. But recent years have also seen an increasing turn to the criminalization and repression of climate movements, and not just activists, but also scientists engaged with these issues again across the globe. So there are examples and studies of examples from many different jurisdictions where governments have subjected climate protests to anti-terror legislation, where they have increased the policing and the repression of protest, of course, not just of the climate movement, but also in the context of protest around Palestine, again, in Germany and the US, in very kind of obviously rights restricting ways. And this has also been linked to kind of broader legislative initiatives to frame protest as organized crime, to justify preventive incarceration, fast-tracking juridical cases, and setting up special police units, etc., for repressing protest. So this is the kind of background, let's say, against which I'm interested in civil disobedience, and in which I am also just sort of shocked and astonished again and again by the way in which even the most basic categories of thinking about protest under kind of democratic conditions get mixed up by a lot of politicians, but also by journalists, even sometimes by activists and many others. So, for example, in the European context, a lot of politicians and journalists have trouble to properly place the category of civil disobedience that many climate activists use to describe and justify their own activism. They either think civil disobedience is something completely different than from what these activists are doing, or they think civil disobedience is itself illegal and therefore should be criminalized and repressed. And very often they blur the lines between, for example, civil disobedience and other categories such as terrorism, which then serve to sort of increase the pressure of policing and persecution for those activists. So in response to these tendencies to delegitimize protest, also by way of framing it as too radical or as terrorism, I think it's important to sort of be clear about what civil disobedience entails, how that concept is to be understood, what the civil in civil disobedience refers to. So I'll speak a bit about that in the first section. Then I will say something about the contested relation between civil disobedience and violence, and also one specific form of violence that is often let's say, at the root of this confusion between civil disobedience and terrorism, namely the destruction or damaging of property. And finally, I'll talk, if the time suffices for that, a bit about how this idea of the civil needs to be rethought in the current situation of climate catastrophe. So, of course, civil disobedience has a very long and complex history. You've probably all encountered the famous paradigm cases from Thoreau via Gandhi to Martin Luther King and to the present. But despite all this complexity, there is, I think, a kind of dominant liberal understanding that, at least for a long time, has dominated both the theoretical discussion but also the public discussion. And that is exemplified in the works of influential authors such as John Rawls or Jürgen Habermas, and that, in my view, leads to an overly constrained and kind of depoliticized understanding of disobedience, because it relies on a very narrow account of what makes civil disobedience civil. Now, in this kind of classical or traditional liberal understanding, civil disobedience consists in acts of protests that citizens engage in a public, non-violent, purely symbolic, morally justified, and communicative manner. Although it's illegal, it involves breaking the law. They do so in order to press for certain sort of local changes in the political or legal order, while recognizing the kind of general legitimacy of this order. And the idea is that in order to express that recognition of the general legitimacy, they also accept the punishment. They kind of let themselves arrested, they go to court, and if the court sentences them, they will go to prison for that. Now, I think that understanding of disobedience certainly fits some acts of protest, and indeed some acts of protest that are clearly acts of civil disobedience, and also civil disobedience in the context of the contemporary climate movement. So think of Jane Fonda on the picture here on the slide, who's getting herself arrested on Capitol Hill a few years ago during a climate protest. But I think it's a very kind of restricted understanding, and one that only captures a part of the repertoire of protest practices that I think we should subsume under this category of civil disobedience. And it's therefore, this too narrow category is therefore unfit, I think, to think of civil disobedience both historically but also and especially in the current constellation. So why is that? I mean, there's again a big discussion about this, to which I've contributed, trying to argue that this traditional conception is too narrow. It's unclear why you would want to restrict civil disobedience to an exclusively symbolic act when almost all historical examples, and in fact examples that you could think of acts of civil disobedience, do involve forms of intervention or disruption that are more than symbolic, blockades, occupations, sit-ins, and other disruptive tactics. There's a couple of examples in the form of photos. So German environmentalists unleashing a herd of goats to disrupt police operations that were there to clear the path for nuclear transport, for the transportation of nuclear waste. Students of my former university in Amsterdam blocking the car of the president of the university to protest against cuts and repression of student protest, or climate activists in Berlin blocking a bridge. These are all, of course, also symbolic acts. That's clear. They want to communicate something, but they also do more than just communicate. They do more than just sort of engage in an exclusively or purely symbolic intervention. Cost raising plays a role. There's forms of direct action, intervention, disruption. And these are also, as I said, always also symbolic, but they're not merely symbolic. And I would argue that the symbolic power depends on that fact that they're not merely symbolic. If they were merely symbolic, I think the symbolic power would also be quite another aspect that is often mentioned in the classical liberal definition is that those who engage in civil disobedience recognize the legitimacy of the existing system. They don't challenge it fundamentally. I think that's another problematic restriction. They had a pretty ambitious program for transforming the fundamental order in which they live. And the same is true civil disobedience today. Democracy movements, anti-racist movements, and of course the climate movement, one of whose slogans is system change, not climate change. Finally, in the liberal conception, the idea is that in civil disobedience, the civil refers to the fact that these are citizens engaging in a conversation with each other about the terms of living together. And again, I think that's not wrong, but it's again too limited because civil disobedience in recent decades has very often been the political practice of choice for groups that have been excluded from formal citizenship. Migrants protesting the European border regime, young people protesting a politics in which they have no say because they can't vote yet, citizens of other states protesting the policies of the global north, etc. As a result, I think it's clear that we have to move beyond the narrow liberal paradigm, and we should reconceptualize civil disobedience in a broader, more radical and more radically transformative and democratic register. I give a very brief version of the redefinition here on my terms, on the terms that this argument would propose. Civil disobedience is an intentionally unlawful and principled collective act of protest, in contrast to other forms of protest that might be legal, such as registered demonstrations. It's principled in contrast to ordinary criminal offenses or forms of rioting that have no clear political purpose, with which citizens now, my understanding in the broad sense of the term, so not formally recognized as citizens necessarily, but people who act as if they are citizens, pursue the political aim of changing norms, institutions, and self-understanding, sometimes in very fundamental ways. That's important to get the contrast to conscientious objection right, and in ways that should be seen as civil as opposed to military, in order to mark a contrast with more militant forms of resistance. Now, I think civil disobedience is especially important as a practice that is politicizing and democratizing. It seeks to reassert political agency against entrenched and often invisibilized forms of domination, exclusion, etc. That's, for example, true for the border regime and migrant activism, but I think it's also true for a lot of climate disobedience, which seeks to politicize the existential threats of the climate crisis that are all too often either completely denied or just seen through a kind of technocratic lens. All of this while recognizing that there is a bond uniting those who are protesting and also those against whom they protest. So the civil, in my understanding, in civil disobedience is precisely a reference to this bond. You don't treat or designate the other as an enemy that has to be excluded or maybe even annihilated, but you treat them as an opponent, but as someone who is still part of the same political community and who is who you seek maybe to pressure, but certainly not to violently exclude. That's why, my understanding, as I will clarify in a moment, the civil is quite compatible with a degree of militancy and of confrontation, but incompatible with certain forms of violence. So why then not make it even broader and sort of go in the direction of uncivil disobedience? That's a proposal that some other authors have made, who have rightly, I think, pointed out that the notion of civility is very easily abused. I think there's something to hold on to. I think the category of civil disobedience is important for strategic, but also for theoretical, principled reasons. And I think we can explain what that is, the civil, without making it into this kind of disciplinary tool that is in fact often used to silence protesters who have the wrong aims or who are the wrong protesters or who employ the wrong means. Now, when we turn to the normative, which I will not speak about that much now and maybe come back to later, I think it's very important to, again, in light of the confusions of the current public discourse on disobedience to keep certain distinctions in mind. So I want to argue that civil disobedience has a fundamental claim to legitimacy because of the way in which our societies are organized and the kind of democratic and justice deficits that are almost, well, structurally part of the organization of these societies. So they are not just contingent or marginal features, but they are very much baked into the way our societies are organized. And therefore, civil disobedience plays a fundamental role in addressing these democratic and justice deficits, which, in my view, gives civil disobedience a kind of fundamental legitimacy. But that, of course, doesn't mean that it's justified in every individual case. And even if you think it's justified in a particular case, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best in the sense of the strategically best option in that case in terms of appropriateness or effectiveness. And these things are very often mixed up in the debate. So if you look at the public discourse on climate activists, even a lot of Green Party politicians in Germany are really annoyed at the climate activists, and they slide very quickly from saying this is just stupid to this is morally outrageous to this should be banned and we should, put them into prison. And these are, I want to insist, just very different judgments, and you shouldn't slide from one into the other. I think we can recognize the fundamental legitimacy of this form of political protest. We can agree, I hope, that it's justified in many cases, and we can still have disagreements on whether it's the best way to go in a particular circumstance. I also think it's not the task of the philosopher to say when an act of protest is justified or not, because that's a matter of public discussion and that will be contested. But I think it's possible to say something about the, let's say, parameters that should, or the dimensions that should be taken into account. Because again, there's a worry that if we give protest this kind of positive role to play, that we won't be able to make a difference between protests that we like, let's say anti-racist and climate justice, disobedience, and the protest that we might not like, namely, far-right activism or something like that. And I think we can say something about that going beyond simple political preference. I mean, I think it makes a difference whether civil disobedience, which stands in need of justification in a kind of roughly democratic society, whether it rests on a diagnosis that has evidence on its side, right? So whether the claim that we are in a climate crisis is well justified empirically, whether scientists agree on that, that makes a difference for the legitimacy of that kind of protest movement, just as claims about election rigging or conspiracies, etc., make a difference for other protest movements, how we evaluate them. It makes a difference how those movements are organized, whether they are kind of organized in a more democratic, inclusive manner or in a more authoritarian manner. And finally, and maybe most importantly, it makes a difference what those movements and forms of disobedience are aiming at. So what the objective is. Are these objectives aimed at securing rights for more people? Are they aimed at sort of aims that are, let's say, universal or universalizable? Or are those aims that are particularistic that want to secure the interests or the rights of a particular group and sort of push others out or strip them of their rights? So these are, I think, quite important aspects to take into account when we sort of, the particular act of civil disobedience is justified or not. Okay, so I'll be very quick now to wrap up and have enough time for discussion. The question of violence is very tricky. My main point is to say we shouldn't just equate the civil with the non-violent or the peaceful, because what these categories encompass is absolutely unclear. You see that in some of the main authors, Habermas and Rawls, for example, they're very quick to say, well, obviously civil disobedience has to be non-violent, but they say nothing about what that actually means. So what is violence? What counts as non-violent? If you look into social reality, this is very disputed, right? I mean, in Germany, for example, one of the paradigm forms of action that we would usually associate with civil disobedience, namely a passive sit-in, just sitting on the street, not doing anything, is by criminal law categorized as coercion by force, so as a violent form of coercion. And this has been, a kind of staple of German criminal and constitutional law. So we shouldn't be too quick. We should be able to distinguish different forms of violence and see that some of them are incompatible with civil disobedience. I would say what is incompatible are kind of offensive forms of violating the physical integrity of other persons. But there are other forms of action that are often seen as violent, spoken about as violent, including sort of violence in self-defense when one is attacked by the police or by political opponents, or violence against oneself, which plays an important role in protest movements, and especially violence against things, so property destruction, that these can be forms of violence that are actually quite compatible with the civility of civil disobedience. So one of the cases that is relevant for the climate movement is property damage and destruction, and very often political calls for criminalizing this movement focus on these acts of violence, although they then suggest with the terrorism label that in truth they're also targeting humans or people, which they usually don't. So that's the first thing to really keep in mind here. When a movement is called violent, ask what forms of violence are highlighted. Ask yourself whether you think that property damage and destruction are the same as violence against persons, and whether that makes a difference for how you assess forms of civil disobedience. And then ask, even if you look at violence in quotation marks against property or things, what are we looking at? I mean, whose property are we looking at? Is it damaged, destroyed, deactivated? What is the damage, et cetera, et cetera? So these are questions I think that matter when we look at these charges against the climate movement. And I want to end by just pointing out that in light of the climate crisis, I think it's possible to give both a conceptual and a normative account of civil disobedience that covers a lot of the activism that the climate movement has been engaged in, despite the whole discourse of radicalization and criminalization that seeks to sort of delegitimize the climate movement. I'll have in the discussion. I think there are basically four, let's say, pathways for justification here. Self-defense in response to the climate emergency. I think it's interesting, but until now it has been kind of limited in its political and legal force. Addressing substantial and massive injustices. It's a classical justification for civil disobedience, and also forms of resistance that go further than civil disobedience. Addressing democratic deficits, again, a classical basis for resistance in civil disobedience. And finally, and I think for the environmental movement in general, but also for more recent climate movements, also of special importance, disobedience as a reaction to epistemic domination and forms of ignorance that kind of limit the ways in which people are thinking about themselves and the future. Okay, so overall, I hope I was able to suggest at least that civil disobedience is a really important category to think about protest and movements in our present, especially in the context of the climate catastrophe, but that it also requires stretching the concept of civil disobedience, of the civil, a bit, stretching the practices of civil disobedience beyond the kind of limited repertoire that they're sometimes constrained to. So thinking a bit more broadly about what violence actually entails and why certain forms of violence might be compatible with the civil, stretching it beyond the boundaries of methodological and political nationalism. So the idea that somehow we're living in these closed units, the nation states and citizens are just interacting with each other. I think the climate crisis very clearly forces us beyond this kind of boundary and container thinking. And third, we can see, I think, that civil disobedience also in this context seeks to open up a space for politicization and democratization, that is often seen as apolitical for structural reasons. I mentioned the property regime here, but I think this is really true for the climate crisis more broadly speaking. And well, the last one is very speculative, whether there is any kind of form of collective political agency on the planetary level. Well, it doesn't look so at the moment, but if there is any movement in that direction, I think it will surely involve the climate movement very prominently. All right, thanks for your attention. Sorry to go on a bit longer, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Not at all. That was very concise. Thank you so much. Um, so let's see. Can everyone see the gallery? Maybe that's just I hope everyone can see each other. We invite you to show your face on camera. It's always nice to know who's in the room. Of course, you don't have to, but it's always nice to see a few faces. Thank you so much, Robin. That was really interesting and rich, as we would, of course, expect from a philosopher thinking about these issues. Before I start, some questions. There was a question about the slides, so we will share the recording that also has the slides, but I'm also wondering if you have some of your publications where this has been written up, or is this, can you recommend any of your publications where you have written these arguments and we can reread them in peace, or is it not yet written up?
Yeah, I can put some things in the chat in a second, some links,
Okay.
there will be. I can also share the slides if anyone is interested, and I will have a paper on climate disobedience in a new edited volume that will come out in a few months. So I put that in the chat, and then people can follow up if they're interested. Thank you.
Excellent. Or just your ResearchGate page or Google Scholar page with your publications. That would be great. And yeah, you don't have to do it now. I don't mean to push you into multitasking, but maybe later at some point. All right, so the format now for the discussion, we have about 50 minutes. First, I'll ask a few questions and just be in discussion with Robin that we developed from the team, and then we'll open up, at least in the last half hour or a bit longer, for questions from the group. So I think one question I was thinking about as you were talking about the notion of the civil is that I think there can be like a confusion or a conflation, a different way of understanding what civil actually means, and that came out in your discussion quite a bit. So I'm wondering if you could just say if I understood that correctly. So I think one can understand the term civil and civil disobedience as being about like respectable, right? Like behaved. But that's clearly not what you mean by it, or what many people who actually engage in civil disobedience mean by it. I think there are perhaps these images of MLK, for example, and the civil rights movement kind of dressing in their Sunday's best to, do a blockade or a sit-in, and maybe that's part of where that idea comes from. But I think in your presentation, it seemed that you are suggesting that the term civil rather comes from the idea of civilians addressing other civilians and trying to persuade them or pull them into awareness and action. So could you comment a little bit on what we actually mean when we say civil disobedience?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, you're absolutely right that there is this multiplicity of meanings that the civil is attached to or gives rise to, and that there is, in my view, often a kind of conflation between the civil and, as you said, the respectable or the moderate, etc. And while I think it's true that these can be kind of strategies for protest movements, I think the core of the civil is really somewhere else. And I also think that this is already true for many of the classical historical examples that people then sometimes have in mind when they make these short circuits between the civil and the moderate, or the civil and the respectful. So I mean, when Black Lives Matter happened, there were a lot of critiques of the Black Lives Matter movement from liberals or conservatives who said, well, yeah, it's okay to protest against racism, but you should do it the way that Martin Luther King did it, respectfully, without being too disruptive. And there were these, opinion pieces, like Martin Luther King never occupied a freeway and stuff like that, which are just historically completely wrong, and which just shows how little people know about the civil rights movement and the very mass-based and often disruptive, and in some ways very radical forms that it took. And many historians of the civil rights movement, Jeremy Theoharis and Aaron Pineda and others, have pointed out that there is also this kind of retrospective sanitation of protest movements that in a way have been officially recognized that doesn't really fit with the reality that those movements encountered back in the day when they were in the same situation. I mean, they were portrayed as terrorists. They were faced with police repression, and the justifications were very similar to the ones that movements are facing. And today, I mean, even a kind of hero like Nelson Mandela was on the U.S. terrorism watch list well into the 90s. And so, we have to be aware of that, how these categorizations operate and how they change historically. For me, the civil is indeed linked to the idea of the citizen in the sense of those who are sort of part of a political community or bound by a political bond, not necessarily of, let's say, formal citizenship, as I emphasized, but as, let's say, a commitment to work conflicts out in a nonviolent way, insofar as that is possible. And so Etienne Balibar, a French philosopher, has actually said that in conditions of violence, when you're surrounded by violence, civility doesn't simply mean non-violence. It means trying to work in the situation in a way that doesn't amplify violence, it doesn't reproduce violence, it reduces violence, it moves the situation away from violence into a more genuinely political direction. So it's not necessarily denying violence, it's not necessarily incompatible with violence, but it has to be a form of practice and commitment that ultimately seeks to reduce violence or move from violence to a more political form of conflict resolution. And so I think that's the way in which I would try to understand it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And another distinction you made early in your presentation was about civil disobedience often being symbolic in nature, but then you argued that actually when we look at real-world examples of it, it is also often material in that it seeks to disrupt, for example, something linked to climate harm. So in my own research, I have been thinking about whether that distinction matters for observers and how it is perceived, and whether this is something we need to think about more carefully, both in our strategizing, but also just theoretically. So this difference between symbolic disruption and material disruption, right? The difference between, for example, chaining oneself to a pipeline versus chaining oneself to the White House gate, or, disrupting, for example, an art exhibit versus disrupting a site of climate harm. So to what extent do these different forms of civil disobedience, and also just considering the wide range of different types of civil disobedience that people engage in, to what extent does that matter for whether people perceive it as legitimate? That was another of your important distinctions, is, for example, the material disruption of something more directly tied to climate harm perceived as more legitimate than symbolic disruption of art, and should that matter strategically and theoretically?
Yeah, thank you. That's also a very important and good question. So my first point would be that this is a kind of continuum, and that we shouldn't think of the poles of the continuums as sort of categories that are distinct, right? So I think it's true that some forms of civil disobedience are really much more on the symbolic side and have a less directly disruptive or less of a direct action kind of component, while some forms of direct action have not so much of a symbolic component, forms of sabotage, etc., might be cases in point there. But I think, so first of all, it's a continuum. So a lot of forms of protest intervention will be situated somewhere in between the extreme poles of this. And I think that's also important, not just conceptually, to sort of not think of those as opposites or to kind of reify the poles of the continuum, but I think it's also quite important because there is sometimes a kind of self-misunderstanding on the side of activists on both, on the whole continuum, let's say. I mean, so you have sometimes activists who think that through their engaging in a more direct form of intervention, they can literally bring the thing about that they're trying to realize as a political goal. And this can sometimes turn very concretistic or fetishistic in a way when you think that, we have to be here and we have to defeat the opponent right here, right now. And in many cases, I think this is just not how it works. This is not how politics works. This is not how you get modern power relations to kind of be transformed, right? I mean, we had, for example, climate activists some years ago who started a hunger strike in front of the German chancellery. And they said, well, we will continue on our hunger strike until the chancellor does this or that. Right? I mean, you can see that as a symbolic intervention, of course, as well, where you just try to increase the symbolic pressure, gain media attention, bring the chancellor in a very difficult position, etc. But some of the protesters really thought that they could, like literally through that action, force the political change. And I think that was a very dangerous kind of self-misunderstanding. And luckily, the situation was resolved in a way before the worst could happen. Because, I think this is really not how it works usually, right? I mean, I'm not saying that this is never how it works, but usually this is not how it works. But on the other side, this can also happen that you have people join a form of, a protest event, for example, because they think, well, this is merely symbolic. So, clearly nothing dangerous can happen. And so they join naively, or they don't really think about the risks, or they don't think about the material side of things, where you have to be prepared that you're also doing something that has a different materiality to it, that will not simply be taken as a communicative act, right? That will be traceable, that will, that might be the police might intervene, etc., etc. So I think it's important that there is a kind of self consciousness amongst activists about that continuum and the entanglements of these different sides as well. And then finally, with regard to the the question of well, it's a bit of a question like also about where should activists intervene? So what should they target in a way, right? And is it important for activists to target those scenes where the connection is obvious? Now, I don't think there's a general answer to it. I mean, I think it depends also on, I mean, civil disobedience as a category sometimes has the disadvantage that we look at particular acts, while very often we should look at broader timeframes and different phases in a movement that uses civil disobedience as a practice or a tactic. And again, thinking in terms of the climate movement, I think something can make a lot of sense in an early phase of the movement, but be less adequate and less effective at a later phase, right? I mean, so if your group is very small and if you need to kind of mobilize public attention, etc., it can make sense to use a tactic like blocking, early morning traffic on a highway, even if you know that those people in the cars driving to work early in the morning are not the main drivers of the climate crisis and also not the main obstacles to addressing it, right? These are just usually workers who have to go to work and they don't have a good alternative. And so, but the problem is that if you keep on doing that, it can backfire, as it did in the case of the climate movement, which then tried to also find other targets for their interventions, whether these were paintings, which caused its own problems, or private jets at airports, where the connection was much more clear, because these are symbols of the connection between, the lifestyle of the ultra rich and the kind of ways in which they destroy the climate at a much faster rate than ordinary working people, or whether they try to, block fossil fuel extraction by occupying a mine, etc., etc. So I think these are examples where the link is then much closer, and this can make a difference at depending on the phase of the movement we're looking at. But I don't think it's a kind of normative requirement, and I don't think it's obviously the case that this always works or is always the best idea. I mean, it can't really be a normative requirement, because otherwise you would have to, sometimes do things that are very dangerous instead of intervening in situations or places where you can intervene, but then that might not be as directly connected with the harm or the injustice or the democratic deficit that you seek to draw attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're suggesting there might be kind of a temporal arc of when we use which tactics, but I think also from your focus earlier on legitimacy as an important component of civil disobedience, it might play a role there as well, right? When we disrupt climate harm directly, or the sites of climate harm directly, it might be perceived as more legitimate than the more symbolic, more removed, distant types of disruption. So that could influence probably public opinion. That might be one way to assess it, legitimacy.
That's true. But just one thought, if I may, on this, because sometimes you have to also, in terms of this epistemic dimension of civil disobedience, you have to draw a connection where people don't yet see it. So you might have to intervene in a place where people think, well, why are they doing this, right? And then you must be able to explicate that connection. So there was some, with some of the Just Stop Oil, etc. actions in the Netherlands, for example, in cultural institutions, they were aimed at drawing attention to the ways in which especially Shell, the oil company in the Netherlands, has been, very, very massively involved in the cultural sector, not out of altruism, but for clearly strategic reasons. And so intervening in a place like the Van Gogh Museum or other museums as climate activists was, on the one side, maybe people would say, well, why do they do that? There's no connection here. But it had precisely the point of drawing a connection where people were not willing or able to see it before.
Exactly. And that is linked to the next question I had, which is about, I think all of these questions are linked to the purpose or goal of civil disobedience, right? Like, why are we doing it? What is our main goal? And so in your early slides, you mentioned that in the kind of dominant liberal understanding of civil disobedience, that communication or appealing to the majority is a main function of civil disobedience. When I think about definitions of civil disobedience, I always go back to Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, where he has this quote, which on better days when I have slept more and more focused, I can say, I can remember the exact words, but paraphrasing it, I mean, he basically says that it's about like shaking them into awareness, getting people's consciousness raised, basically, and getting people to pay attention where before they were kind of lulled into business as usual. So that would suggest that, again, like communicating, getting the majority to pay attention, to be aware, to support the goals of the climate movement more is one primary goal of civil disobedience. But then again, in the examples we have seen, it's also often about directly, and maybe that's goes more into the terminology of direct action, right? Directly intervening in climate harm. So I guess my question for you is whether you would also say or say that the primary goal of civil disobedience is to communicate with other civilians and get them on board and raise awareness and gain more support for the movement, or is civil disobedience also always or sometimes about directly intervening in climate harm, kind of much more at the source, versus more indirectly through gaining support for the movement and its goals?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think the passage that you have in mind from the letter, Martin Luther King's letter, is probably the one where he says that it's about creating a crisis and kind of
Right.
fostering attention in a situation where many people have chosen to ignore or not to confront an issue, which is already a crisis, but just not for them. And so the idea is that it might be necessary to kind of force people to acknowledge that there is a crisis by way of creating a crisis for them to acknowledge the crisis that others are already subject to. And I think that fits obviously quite well for the case of the climate crisis as well. So I mean, I think that the in the case of climate protest and what I refer to as property destruction, damage, deactivation, it's a complex phenomenon, obviously, and we would have to look at individual cases. But at least in the cases where we had kind of occupations of large scale fossil fuel infrastructure, the idea was mostly not that you could really stop it right there and then that would last, but rather it was that plus an awareness of the symbolic, nature of that intervention. And they knew that they wouldn't, be allowed to stay there for very long. They knew that they would just, repair the machinery and continue with the extraction, and they knew that ultimately on that level of sabotage or direct action, you couldn't stop the whole machine. So it's about creating tensions. It's about showing people what is happening. It's also about raising the cost. Obviously, raising the cost is something else than thinking you can stop it right away. And it is, I think, very much about kind of politicizing the whole question and the question whether that's the kind of uh, extraction that we want to have in our neighborhood, that we want to support, that we want to continue to live off, and so on. So I think that's the direction in which I would go, where you couldn't really have the symbolic effect if you wouldn't really go there and do these things, right? Quite directly and quite materially speaking. But it's also something else than just thinking that through an act of kind of sabotage, you can really stop the system or interrupt the system. But there are other examples, of course, where, let's say in indigenous struggles in the Americas, where the symbolic is less relevant maybe, and the direct interruptive uh, form of intervention is more relevant and more directly related to just interrupting and forcing companies and states to do it differently.
Mhm. And this is linked to a final question I will ask. We had many more prepared, but I see many people in the room who themselves are activists and engaged in civil disobedience, and I'm sure are burning to ask questions. So I'll just ask one more question and then open it up to the rest of the group. In our field of social psychology, there's also just a huge mess of terminology and a conflation of many different terms that are used. So I see Mette, Dr. Uysal in the room, who has written a whole paper on this, the idea of, for example, normative versus non-normative action, or radical versus non or less radical, conventional, unconventional, and then disruptive or less disruptive, right? So we often have these binaries, which you already called into question a bit. But I think there's also a lot of conceptual overlap between many of them. You also mentioned nonviolent direct action. And I see these discussions in the conflation and activist discussions as well, right? Like some people use the term NVDA, others say civil disobedience, others use disruptive action. So I'm wondering what your thoughts as a philosopher and someone who thinks carefully about the concepts are about the need to distinguish civil disobedience as a category in and of itself, versus having, for example, an overarching term such as disruptive action, where civil disobedience is maybe one subtype of disruptive action. And if that would be the case, what differentiates it from other forms of disruptive action? Is it, for example, the element of being in opposition or breaking the law, being arrestable? Is there civil disobedience that doesn't involve the risk of arrest? So how do we distinguish this mess of terminology that we have in our fields? And is it even important to do so? And if so, why and how?
Yeah, thanks. So, so on the one hand, I'm skeptical of conceptual distinctions if they become too rigid, and I think it's important to acknowledge that these concepts are at least blurry at the edges, and that from a theoretical perspective, I don't think it's anyone's job or my job to kind of give a very clear definition that allows us to include and exclude every kind of act that we're confronted with. But that being said, I do think that the category fulfills a certain function, and that, as a matter of fact, it has evolved in the legal political cultures of let's just say European, North American especially, but also in other contexts over the last couple of decades as a category that has a certain also normative meaning, and that carries with it a kind of presumption of legitimacy, which I think is very important for movements that use that category and try to claim it and reclaim it also against attempts of designating them in a different way. And then at the same time, it's quite interesting in terms of looking at the philosophy and the theories of civil disobedience, that a range of very influential authors from very different backgrounds have embraced it and have tried to show that it's really central from their point of view. I already mentioned respects are quite different in their positions, but Hannah Arendt is another author. I mentioned Etienne Balibar briefly. Now, these have very different kind of philosophical, political convictions, but they all agree that that category designates something important for their own understandings of democracy, justice, etc. And then, of course, we have the fact that some of the most prominent practitioners of civil disobedience have also been some of their main theorists. Gandhi and King have written extensively, of course, on these categories, not just sort of in terms of concrete examples, but in trying to theorize them, trying to spell out the normative and conceptual meanings and implications. And so there's a lot there in these categories, I think, that we can use, which is not necessarily the same for other categories, right? I mean, even for others that operate in the vicinity, such as direct action or sabotage, etc. I mean, of course, people have written about this, including many activists, but not as extensively as on civil disobedience. So I think there are some reasons, principled reasons, theoretical reasons, but also strategic reasons to really hold on to the category and to try to defend it both against those who want to restrict it to a very narrow set of idealized protest acts, and against those who try to sort of criminalize it and say that's really should be repressed, has no place in a democracy, but also against those who think that this is just kind of tame, moderate stuff that is not really interesting from a kind of critical or leftist perspective. I think it really has this kind of more transformative, radical potential, and so that's what I want to sort of bring out and defend. But at the same time, I agree that there are other categories in the vicinity that one could think of, umbrella categories. I like the idea of a disruptive action, but of course, civil disobedience is not merely disruptive. There are other aspects of it as well that maybe go beyond disruption.
Mm-hmm.
I talked briefly about the problems with the category of nonviolence. It depends, I would say. But we shouldn't expect a kind of neat mapping of the whole field, and then we know exactly where civil disobedience fits. I think we have seen in the history of civil disobedience that it's the connections with these other terms, resistance, protest. For me, the interesting question is also, well, which forms of political action today are maybe misinterpreted when we see them as civil disobedience, right? I mean, that was an interesting discussion in the context of Occupy Wall Street, and then a bit later, again, with a lot of indigenous movements also around Standing Rock, where a lot of people said, well, it's not really civil disobedience. That's not how we understand what we are doing. We're not disobeying the state. We don't really take that as a frame of reference for what we're doing at all. And if you see that as civil disobedience, that already means that you put what we're doing into a framework that just doesn't work for us. So these are interesting cases, I think, that I'd like to look into in more detail at some point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, so I will finally be quiet and open up to the many interesting researchers and activists we have here in the audience. I recognize many of you. Raise your hand if you have a question. I'll call on people in the order. We also have at some point, we'll check in the Google Doc to see if there are questions there, but who would like to start with the question? Clara.
Hi there. I'm Clara Vondrich. I'm with Public Citizen. How are you? Thank you so much. So one perennial issue I have is in the movement. I've been a climate activist for many years now. And in the movement, there's always a villain. And one of my mentors, and just, someone I really admire, Bill McKibben, says there always has to be a villain in these kinds of things. And on the other side, I'm part of like trying to be part of a spiritual tradition that is very much about oneness and unity, and there is no distinction between us. And so I really struggle with that dichotomy, and I just wonder if you have any thoughts or insights about how to straddle that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a very interesting, I think, because it's both, let's say, a question about politics and a question about analysis, right? I mean, I think that there is a tension here in general, because on the one hand, you do want to be able to say, well, there are certain people who are responsible and whom we have to maybe hold responsible, and they have taken decisions. They are taking decisions that impact a lot of others who have not been involved in those decisions. And we should increase the pressure on them. We should make that visible, and we should hold them accountable, especially maybe today when these power asymmetries have become even more pronounced, maybe than in comparison to a few decades ago, with the concentration of power and wealth in our societies, where it's kind of people have dispensed with certain democratic procedures, and it's just it's up to this one person to decide what is happening. And if Elon Musk decides to pull the plug on this kind of funding, just hundreds of thousands of people just die as a result of that. And that's something that we should not accept. And we can point to individuals like Musk, and we should do that in these situations. At the same time, it's also, I think, important to point to the more structural dynamics that we can't really so easily personify. And the climate crisis is a good example of that, because in the end, although there are some as you said, villains, we can identify. It's a much more structural problem that we won't be able to address if we think, well, we only have to hold these few villains accountable and then the problem would be solved, right? That's not the case, because a lot of it has to do with the way in which we organized our societies, our economy, and we have to think about a very different, structurally very different way of organizing our lives and our economy if we want to address the climate crisis. And it's also easy to point at villains when we know that we are all implicated in this ourselves, right? I mean, we are also, I mean, not necessarily everyone individually in this room, but we as ordinary people are very much part of the problem in a way, right? I mean, we continue to elect politicians, we continue to organize our own economic lives in a way that is also an obstacle to meaningful change. And sometimes we think that by engaging in this or that symbolic act, we kind of do what is necessary, but in truth, we would have to change much more fundamentally, maybe than some of us are ready for, right? And so I think there's these different levels, and at least we should be careful not to personify too much, or to think that if we somehow hold these people accountable, then the problem will be solved.
Thank you so much.
Ali, go ahead.
Hi, Robin and everybody. I'm Ali, a social psychologist, and I
And
really like your
co-organizer of the series. Don't forget that.
Yeah, and thanks for your talk. That was great, and I really like your perspective. You basically, and especially your criticism of Habermas and Rawls in terms of the way that they argue what civil disobedience entails, and etc. And when it comes to your conceptualization, I wonder if there is a radical potential that by putting the issue of civil to be in terms of disagreement or agreement, that doesn't take into account the radical potential of the civil disobedience. For instance, when you gave the example of Gandhi, when he was basically asking to stop consuming, and he was basically asking for subversion of the system. It wasn't just a mere disagreement that he wanted to address, but it was much more subversive and much more radical. And so I wonder if we put this civility on disagreement to something like that, it might actually basically still puts into that communicative framework that Habermas basically talks about, and it doesn't take into account that subversive element that we might see in a lot of the strong civil disobedience movements. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Thank you. And I think I agree with you. I mean, I think it's important that the civility is not just a disagreement, but it's also, and maybe it's also not just subversion, but it's also enacting, a certain claim or right that you have or that you should have, but that is not recognized. I mean, I've worked a lot on migrant disobedience, and especially on forms of border crossing that are illegal or irregularized, but that many migrants still enact because they, for very good reason, I think that their rights are violated and not recognized, and they say, well, they don't recognize, so we will just enact our rights. We will just cross the borders because we know we are allowed to. We know we have a right, a historical right, a right in terms of current harms, etc., that is not recognized, but it is enacted in that form of disobedience. So there's something also much more, let's say, positive there, a kind of alternative political imaginary, political practice, political community that is, I think, also missing if we just focus too much on the negative or the symbolic dimension of it, right? I mean, when you cross a border irregularly, it's not primarily an appeal on a symbolic act. You just cross the border because you have to be on the other side of it. And if you think that you don't only do that because you want to have a better life, but that you have a right to that, I think the normative significance of that is also different from just saying, well, I just do it because I want to survive. I just do it because I have certain interests. I mean, many refugees and migrants actually are quite able and willing to lay out the broader rationale for doing that, and the fact that they end up in, very often at least, in states that have formerly colonized their societies, or that are currently economically dominating them, or that are waging war against them, or in the region, that's very much on their mind. And they, I mean, migration can trace these connections that we don't want to see, and also insist that they have political implications today in terms of claims to membership and to rights that are not recognized. So, yeah, I would agree with you, and I would sort of expand it into this direction.
Thank you.
Janan or Fuad or anyone who has been tracking the Google Doc, do we have questions in there? Or also Fuad, I know you also had some questions I didn't get to read out if you want to.
We have many.
Many?
But yeah. Tim?
Yeah, Tim, go ahead.
Thank you. I thank you so much for your talk, and I'm really enjoying this conversation. I was wondering if the foundations of nonviolent civil disobedience through the Martin Luther King's Jr.'s nonviolence principles, if you or anybody was familiar with the 6 steps of nonviolence, as it was documented in Hagu Kaz's book, Healing Resistance, and on many websites. I think I put a link to one of them in the Google Docs, because the nonviolent civil disobedience is just step 5 out of 6, and so I was wondering if the other 4 that precede it is something that we could be focused on, so that we could win back the public narrative that is being controlled by mainstream media, and we might even be able to gather enough information, enough evidence that we have never had a democracy in anything but name only. The Founding Fathers created the US government, and Western democracies have copied it for a couple reasons: to control resistance and rebellion, and to protect their private riches that were stolen from the Commonwealth. So I just mentioned that gathering evidence is so important to win the public's, earn their respect and protect dignity by focusing civil disobedience on the reality of what we're up against. And yeah, I just thought I would start with the 6 steps. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I definitely agree that these are all important aspects, and maybe to a certain extent preconditions. When I said that it makes a difference to the claim of legitimacy of disobedience, whether its initial diagnosis is kind of well supported or not. It's what I have in mind, right? That you need to gather evidence, you need to gather information, you have to try to make sure that you have a good case. I mean, you cannot, simply start a campaign of disobedience and then sort of say, well, when you ask, well, what's the justification? Well, I'm not sure, and I have to think about it, or I had a dream. I mean, that's not the best example, maybe because of the significance of that speech for MLK, but you cannot just come up with some, subjectivist stuff. You have to be able to lay out the evidence. You have to be able to point to and empirical, sociological, historical data supporting your case, etc. And of course, it's important to try to convince others as well, because it's usually, if you want to go beyond one spectacular intervention, it's usually necessary to mobilize, larger numbers, and for that, you need to, spread the claims that you want to advocate for. But I'm not sure it can always be thought of as a sequence in this kind of chronological order, right? Because well, sometimes the circumstances are just very urgent, and you need to, raise the alarm right away, or you might need to intervene quickly to prevent serious harm from happening. Sometimes you might not have access to the means of educating others. So step 4, sort of presenting the case. Sometimes you might not be in a position to negotiate because the forces that rule don't have an interest in negotiating with you. And so I don't think it can be a sequence in the sense of, well, first you have to try all these things, and then only then can you engage in disobedience of a more disruptive sort. But I definitely do agree that these are all important aspects to keep in mind. And indeed, for the climate movement, that has been a challenge as well, right? I mean, especially since the public and media reaction has been quite hostile. It's very difficult to get out of this more defensive position, where then it's sort of more about consolidating the core of the movement, and you don't really get to the phase where you can reach broader parts of the population. So I think that's a strategic challenge many movements are faced with, and that they have to try to somehow respond to. In social movement studies, the idea is always that you have to have a strong kind of normative claim. You have to try to preserve some kind of unity, even as the movement grows, which, if you've ever been in a political movement, it's very, very difficult, because the occasion to split arises, around every corner. You have to try to have a relevant, size. So numbers are important, and you need commitment, and you need kind of longer term commitment, right? Because it's one of the biggest challenges also for many social movements, that people come in often mobilized by something that happened, and then there's a kind of short-term expectation of success that is very often disappointed. And it's a very problematic psychological dynamic for many movements, that people get very involved quickly and then lose energy and commitment for understandable reasons, because there is no immediate success. And I think it's extremely important that movements try to immediately build kind of infrastructures and organizational capacities for the mid-term or longer term, to prevent this dynamic from dissolving them too quickly. And I mean, Martin Luther King was very good at that, but it cost a huge effort and a lot of people beyond King to do that, obviously.
Thank you.
Marianne.
Thank you, Robin. This was, can you hear me? Really fantastic. And I have a lot of thoughts, and one of them has to do with the whole property damage and so forth, and that incidentally also the document. So there's a way in which personal property, or whatever the state considers to be property, is so much more protected than the common good, which also is a common property, but it never seemed the protection of the common good stands so weak, right, in the modern state. And I just have been thinking about what and it seems to have something to do with the strategic choice that Johanna mentioned earlier, which who is your audience? If you say that we really care about the common good, are you then kind of undermining the state? If you don't respect the property as the state or the government, the society understands it. And I'm a theologian, so for me the common good is something that is something that we need to respect, but we don't have any good framework, because always the condition seems to be always that the needs of the property owner trump the common good every time. Your wisdom on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's also a very fundamental question, and I'm not sure I have any great insights to share. But I definitely agree with your impression. I would by Bertolt Brecht in a different context, but what is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a bank? It's the actual act of robbery is the one that allowed for the founding of the bank and the conversion of things that were commonly owned into private property and then capitalization, etc. I do think, but of course, this is probably also there is some difference across contexts, and I think in the US the discussion is probably a bit different than in other parts of the world. But I do think that both the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis have also led more people to think about private property and commons and common infrastructures in a bit of a different way, because it became, to many people at least, again, obvious in the COVID-19 pandemic that there are certain kind of public infrastructures linked to public goods that, if we privatize them, will simply not serve their purpose in the case of a crisis like the COVID pandemic. Access to health, access to information. If they are privately regulated, you will, as a society, not be able to effectively address such a crisis. So it opened up, at least for a short time, maybe this kind of a broader awareness of the need for public infrastructures, for commons in a way that are not privatized, that are not mediated through the property form, that shouldn't be organized around the profit motive, etc. One could have expected or hoped maybe that the climate crisis would give rise to a similar kind of awareness, and the thought that probably it is a mistake to continue to destroy the planet in ways that very much rely on the propertization of natural resources and the infrastructures of life on the planet. And I think there is a bigger awareness of this, and I think the climate movement has also moved into a direction where it is more aware that the problem also has to do with capitalism, and that you cannot just have a kind of appeal to politicians or an appeal to private consumers to change their behavior, but that you have to more fundamentally think of other ways of organizing the economy. So there's been an interesting convergence, I think, across different movements: the climate movement, anti-capitalist movement, feminist movements, public health movements, that we have to more fundamentally rethink the way we organize a society. But of course, on the other side, there's also what I mentioned before, the kind of response to the crisis that maybe now dominates politically, which basically just says, yeah, we're in a crisis, all right, and that just means that we will keep the goods for us, and we will not. I mean, we didn't really share them before, but we will share them even less now, right? We will restrict them, even in our societies, to a certain subset of the population, and we'll either expel others, or we'll let them die, or we'll just leave them to their own devices if they're not socially strong enough, etc. But I think we have to insist that this is really not in the interest of the majority of people, that they will, even those to whom this is promised, yeah, you will be part of you will get a space in the lifeboat, that they won't. I mean, it's already obvious that no one is going to Mars, so and the promise that somehow people will be part of the bunkers or whatever that the super rich are building is also not something that anyone should count on, right? So I think one has to sort of strengthen this awareness that in the face of this crisis, there is either a solution for the large majority, or it will just be a solution for the very small minority, and most people will just not be part of that. And then, hopefully by some mix between an appeal to self-interest and an appeal to solidarity, over the next years, political majorities will emerge. But I'm not sure if I'm very optimistic. But that would be the only source for hope, I think. And I hope there's more room for optimism soon.
Mm-hmm. And this actually, if I may take back the mic in the last 2 minutes, this relates to a question that Fuad had, one of our organizers here, had put in our collection of questions to you, namely whether the moral philosophy underlying arguments about civil disobedience, whether you would place it more in the realm of utilitarian ethics or deontological ethics, and what is kind of the rationale behind arguments, for example, with regard to property destruction for the greater good, or in general, kind of the kinds of questions we just discussed very quickly in our last minute. This seems like a good question for a philosopher.
Yeah, so I'm not looking at civil disobedience primarily through the lens of moral philosophy. I'm kind of more looking at the political and social side of it, and there I would think that civil disobedience is really a practice to challenge entrenched power relations that are characterized by these justice and democracy deficits, and so as such, it's a tool to assert one's rights and one's perspective in a situation in which they are not taken into account, and so it's more kind of a ideal of democracy or democratic claim making that freedom and equality maybe that is at the basis here than like a moral philosophy, because I also think that these political claims can sometimes then be implemented in a more utilitarian register when you think in terms of, well, how can we achieve a greater success in a shorter time frame, or it can be a more principled argument that then guides your actions, but I don't think it's primarily a moral question. And then with regard to let's say the kind of more normative perspective in political philosophy, I think it's a kind of I mean, in terms of the climate crisis, it has been something like a constitution of humanity as at least a kind of negatively integrated whole, right? I mean, it's a kind of cosmopolitan position, but that is not idealist, as with Kant and others, but it's materially grounded in the fact that through the climate crisis, the conditions of life of humanity are at risk, even if it's manifesting differentially, of course. And so maybe for the first time in history, humanity has, willingly or not, become this kind of collective agent. So it would be a kind of, materially grounded cosmopolitanism, I guess, that I would posit as the normative ground for this particular form of disobedience.
Great, thank you. We learned new jargon. Good. All right, thank you so much. We have to end now because 90 minutes is all we gave on the flyer. This was such a rich and interesting debate and very useful for all of us, I think, both the activists and the scholars here working on these topics. So we will look up your papers on your website. Someone put the link in the chat. And if there is any paper,
yeah, it's almost all on academia, so you'll find it there.
Okay, perfect. So we will look for those there. And the recording will be posted on our website too. And if anyone is interested in presenting in this series after our summer break, then please send us a proposal through the link on the website that was also sent around earlier. So this is our last session before the summer break for this part of the world. We will start up again in September. Okay, thank you so much again, Robin, for your time and your expertise.
Thank you so much for the great discussion. Wonderful questions. Very nice to get to meet with you all. Take care.
See you in Berlin, hopefully at some
Bye-bye.
point.
Yes, please get in touch. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.